do you feel there's a lot of value, especially when it's a complex subject, like, for example, Assad, did he use chemical weapons on his own people or not? I wanted to sort of move forward in time because I feel that freedom of speech has taken on a new meaning as we went into the information age. But before we get there, I wanted to talk about newspapers, magazines, TV, and radio, things that preceded the web and preceded blogs and everything else. So in that era, you wrote a book called Manufacturing Consent, right? Where you talked about essentially 5 mechanisms by which the media, even in a free country like the United States, for freedom of speech, would result in essentially having a party line or some sort of coercive, the mechanism would select for certain speech by the media almost invariably. Would you say that affects all media, or do you think there are exceptions? Like, I know you've been on Amy Goodman's show a lot and so on. Do you say that there is some kind of media that's independent of this of these 5 points, or no?
Well, first of all, remember, it's co-authored book. The main author was Ed Herman, my late colleague. But we didn't say that this is a rigid principle. We said these are factors that affect the way the media present the world to us. Doesn't mean they're 100% applied. We also made it very clear that the media are trustworthy. In fact, most people don't read the book, they just read the title. If you go to the book itself, about a third of it is defense of the media against attacks from Freedom House. Freedom House published 2 huge volumes condemning the press for basically losing the Vietnam War, for not being patriotic enough during the war. Actually, that's the part that I wrote. I went through the charges. They were, 1 volume was claims, the 2nd volume was the evidence. I went through the evidence, total lies, incredible lies. What they actually showed was that the media, the reporters on the scene, were honest, courageous, did their jobs, but did it within a framework of patriotic doctrine. So if you bomb a village and you destroy everything, it's a mistake. You know, it's a departure from our noble effort to bring freedom and democracy. But the reports are accurate and courageous. Reporters hated this. They wanted to be condemned as unpatriotic, going way too far in their adversarial stance. They didn't want to be praised for being honest, courageous, but working within a doctrinal framework that involves subordination to state doctrine. That's the stance. So we're not saying the media are unreliable. First thing I do in the morning is read the New York Times and the Washington Post. That's how you get information. But you have to understand that it's within a framework that selects certain things, throws other things out, gives its own slant on things. So you read an article by their Israel reporter, Philip Kingsley, on the latest interchange between Hamas and Israel. And what it says is, it starts by saying Hamas wrecked apartment houses in Israel and Israel damaged the Gaza Strip. Not exactly what happened. It's exactly the opposite of what happened. But it's not, you can't say they're lying. That's just their way of interpreting Hamas responding to Israeli atrocities in the West Bank, and then Israel smashing up Gaza once again and virtually destroying parts of it. That's their slant on it.
So my question is, if you have people with slants, obviously, and you say you read the New York Times and the Washington Post. Do you feel there's a lot of value, especially when it's a complex subject, like, for example, Assad, did he use chemical weapons on his own people or not? Things like that. Do you think there's value in reading both, let's say, very biased one way and very biased the other way? Because I personally find that reading biased things on both sides, let's say Electronic Intifada on the Israel issue, for example, or Mondo Weiss on the Israel issue, versus anything mainstream, essentially, out of Israel, except maybe Haaretz and 972. But like, if you read both sides, I find that each one tries their best to present a case and to get as much evidence for their arguments as possible. So this way you get a balanced view, or at least all the points were made as well as possible. Whereas if you read something centrist, it could be very milquetoast and the arguments aren't really strong one way or the other. Do you feel there's a value in reading both sides of an issue, or multiple sides of an issue, or not?
I'd prefer the term multiple sides, because there's more than two sides. So yes, it's worth reading the New York Times and Electronic Intifada, but that's hardly balance. Just look at the outreach of the New York Times and the outreach of Electronic Intifada. So it's an elephant and a mouse,
Well, I wouldn't put the New York Times on the pro-Israel side as much as something else. It wouldn't be the counterpart to Electronic Intifada.
It's good to read. We'll take the case you mentioned, the Duma gas attack, the chemical attack. If you look at all the material available, you find an interesting and complex story. It is, my own guess is, I presume Assad carried it out, but it's not a simple story. The OPCW, the investigative authorities, the international authorities, published a document blaming Assad, but it turns out that two of their lead investigators questioned it and were silenced. And if you read Electronic Intifada or Gray Zone, you find the fact that there's serious questions about whether the dissenters should be heard. The OPCW is trying to silence them, won't let them testify. And there have been many protests about this, including people like Bustani, the first director of the OPCW. So yes, there's questions to be asked.
Well, sure. I mean, there are state actors that are always trying to silence things. Just recently with the WHO, people were trying to praise Taiwan for their response to the coronavirus. But because of China's one China policy, the WHO director kowtowed to that, wouldn't mention the Taiwan government very much. And then also the theory that the virus originated in a Wuhan lab was kind of dismissed, laughed out of hand. And it was a bit of a reversal this year, where it might be true or might not, but at least people are now looking into it. And the president of the United States even ordered an investigation into that. Very different than it was last year. So, I think
that's an interesting case. I noticed that one's all over the front pages, but not the fact that the dissidents in the OPCW are being silenced. You can read that if you read Gray Zone. But what people know is what you're hearing, what you just said. And in fact, it's true that the WHO won't overrule China's objections or Washington's objections. It will never criticize the United States because the United States veto it, but we don't talk about that.